Hello, good morning everyone, Rich Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. Here are two 27mm lenses. They are both f2.8 maximum aperture and they are both very compact lenses. One of them is the Fujifilm 27mm f2.8 WR lens, which is usually retailed at $399 US, and the other one is the new TTArtisan 27mm f2.8 lens, which is only $159 US. So it is a lot cheaper than the Fujifilm lens, despite both lenses have very similar specs. So is the TTArtisan a good cheap alternative to the Fuji lens? And what do we need to give up if we go for this much more affordable option? Or is it better to pay more and get the Fuji lens instead? I've done a lot of testing and I'm going to share with you my test results in this video. But before we start, I want to say thank you to Gear for sending me this TTArtisan lens for the review. So if you're interested in buying this lens, you can support them and also support me by checking out their website. And I also want to say a big thank you to Auckland Camera Center for lending me the Fujifilm 27mm f2.8 WR lens so that I can do the comparison between these two Fuji X 27mm f2.8 lenses. Okay, let's start the review by looking at the image sharpness of the TTArtisan 27mm f2.8 lens, and we're also going to do some side-by-side comparison with the Fuji lens as well. If you look at the center of the image and zoom in at 200% zoom, at f2.8 the TTArtisan lens center sharpness is quite decent. But if you compare it with the Fuji is a tiny bit sharper and also has slightly better contrast. Stopping down the lens to f4, TTArtisan's center sharpness is excellent with improved contrast. So if you compare it to the Fuji, there isn't really any noticeable difference anymore. Center sharpness remains excellent until we get to around f11 when diffraction is starting to soften up the image a bit. At f16, the image is noticeably softer. And now let's have a look at the corner. And let's just look at the TTArtisan lens at f2.8 first. Here I'm showing you the corner 200% zoom. One is with the photo focus at the center and one is focused at the corner. And as you can see, there really isn't any noticeable difference in terms of sharpness. So this suggests the TTArtisan lens has very minimal amount of field curvature. And okay, now let's compare the two lenses again. At f2.8, both lenses are slightly soft at the corner, but still very usable to be honest. And there really isn't much difference between these two lenses in terms of corner sharpness. Stopping down the lens would gradually improve the corner sharpness. The Fuji lens is tiny bit better than the TTArtisan lens at the same aperture. At f5.6, the Fuji's corner is already excellent, while TTArtisan you have to stop down a little bit more to f8 to get a similar corner sharpness. So the Fuji is a slightly sharper lens, but overall the difference is actually pretty small. Next, let's talk about bokeh. With the TTArtisan lens, I think you will either like or don't like the bokeh from this lens. While I don't see any nervous halo ring at the edge of the bokeh, there is some pretty strong cat's eye effect from this TTArtisan lens, especially when you're shooting at f2.8. The Fuji lens also has a bit of cat's eye effect, but if you compare the two side by side, you can see the TTArtisan has much stronger cat's eye effect, and this is something that will either make you really want to buy this lens or immediately stop you from buying the lens. Let's compare the vignetting performance of these two lenses and look at the test photos that shot at f2.8. You can see pretty big difference between the two lenses. The TTArtisan has some pretty noticeable light fall off near the corner of the frame, while the Fuji has only very minor light fall off even at f2.8. Now, while the TTArtisan's vignetting performance will improve as you stop down the lens, you need to stop down to f11 if you want to have minimal vignetting. The Fuji lens is definitely much better in this area. Now, there's one thing I do want to mention. Just like pretty much all the mirrorless camera lenses, the Fuji 27mm f2.8 lens also rely on lens profile correction to minimize vignetting, and if you use Adobe Lightroom, You cannot even disable the correction. So I downloaded a trial version of the Iridium developer software and used that to disable the correction for the Fuji lens. And indeed, I do see quite a bit more vignetting now after disabling the profile correction. Having said that, the TTArtisan still has much more vignetting, especially once I disable the lens profile correction as well. And next, we'll see if these two lenses have good or bad chromatic aberration control. And I would say both lenses have very good chromatic aberration control. Looking at the real-world photos that I shot with these two lenses, especially the TTArtisan lens, I really don't see much color fringing at all. Even the photos I shot at f2.8, there's virtually no color fringing. And now let's have a look at distortion. Comparing these two test photos side by side that I shot with these two lenses, the two lenses have very similar and also very minimal amount of distortion. I noticed the Fuji has a slightly wider field of view, but the difference is really quite small. Now, since I already downloaded the Iridium developer software, I also use it to check the distortion test file and remove lens profile correction again. And you can now see some noticeable distortion with both lenses. The TTArtisan has a little bit more distortion than the Fuji. If you like Sunstars, with the TTArtisan lens, you need to stop down to at least FA for Sunstars to start to appear. To get sharper and longer Sunstar tails, you will need to stop down a bit more. At the minimum aperture f16, Sunstars become sharp and it looks pretty nice to my eyes. The Fuji lens, on the other hand, is not really a good choice if you want to have sharp and long Sunstars. You need to stop down to f11 to have some kind of Sunstars in the photo. But the tails of the Sunstars is quite spread out and looks quite messy to me, even when I stop down all the way to the minimum aperture f16. Lens flare control is usually one of TTArtisan's weakest area, and this time when I do the side-by-side test with the Fuji lens, it becomes more apparent. You can see the lens flare with the TTArtisan lens quite easily. Contrast would also drop a lot when there's a strong light source in front of the camera. While the Fuji is not perfect, but its lens flare control is a lot better than the TTArtisan, and if you are someone who likes to shoot backlit scenes, the Fuji would be a much better choice for you. This TTArtisan lens is quite a small lens and it looks very similar to the Fuji 27mm f2.8 lens. Both lenses, they are all very compact, very similar size, and they both have an aperture ring. The TTArtisan is slightly thicker than the Fuji lens, but you can definitely still call it a pancake lens because it is still a really compact lens. Build quality of the TTArtisan lens is pretty decent. The lens feels solid. There's a metal lens mount, and again, it feels very similar to the Fuji lens. However, Fuji is a weather resistant lens, but the TTArtisan is not. Having said that, I have used the TTArtisan lens under a bit of rain without any issue, but if you are planning to shoot under bad weather regularly, then Fuji is probably a safer choice for you. Both lenses have an aperture ring and they are both 3 clicks per stop, so you can adjust the aperture precisely. The aperture ring on the TTArtisan lens feels very nice, but to me, I feel the Fuji lens, the clicks feel slightly better. There's a very subtle difference between the two lenses, but the Fuji just feel a little bit more satisfying to me when you turn the aperture ring. The Fuji lens has a lock button for the aperture ring, so if you have moved the aperture ring to the A position, you need to press the lock button to move it back to manual aperture control. There is a removable lens hood for the TTArtisan lens. It's a very tiny one, and again, it looks very similar to the one that comes with the Fuji lens, and you can actually fit the TTArtisan lens hood on the Fuji lens or vice versa, as they have the same mounting diameter onto the lens. However, I would say this time TTArtisan's lens hood has a better design than the Fuji. With the Fuji lens, there are actually 2 separate lens cap that comes with the lens. One is for you to use with the lens hood and one is without. While with the TTArtisan lens, you can still use the original lens cap if you fit the lens hood on it. So I think that's a more user-friendly design. The TTArtisan's rear lens cap is also a USB dock for you to update the lens firmware. I remember when I reviewed the TTArtisan 32mm AF lens, I asked them why that lens used a micro USB port, and I said it really should use a USB-C port instead. So I'm glad to see this time the 27mm lens use a USB-C connector instead. And if you're wondering whether TTArtisan would actually provide firmware update, if you go to their website, you can see they have indeed released quite a few firmware for their 32mm AF lens already, and even this 27mm lens which was just released, there is already a new firmware update to improve the performance, so that's definitely a very positive sign. Usually there's one thing third-party lens is not quite as good as the first-party lens, and that is the autofocus performance. Quite often the autofocus of the third-party lens will be louder, not quite as smooth, but this time, when I compare the TTArtisan with the Fuji, it is actually the TTArtisan lens that has better autofocus performance. What impressed me the most is that the autofocus operation is very quiet and also very smooth. It's definitely a lot more quiet than the Fuji lens, which sounds a bit like it's pumping air when focusing. However, while the TTArtisan is more quiet in terms of autofocus noise, its aperture is a bit more noisy compared to the Fuji. The autofocus speed is also reasonably fast, definitely faster than TTArtisan's first autofocus lens, the 32mm f2.8, when I reviewed the Nikon set mount version about a year ago. I'm very excited to see that TTArtisan has already matured their autofocus implementation a bit. Maybe that means in the near future we will see some faster or longer focal length autofocus lens from TTArtisan. Imagine one day we see an autofocus version of one of their f0.95 lens. That would be really amazing. The TTArtisan lens can focus down to 35cm, which is not bad at all. And even when you are shooting at the minimum focus distance and maximum aperture f2.8, the photo is still very sharp. Now, interestingly, while the Fujifilm's minimum focus distance is supposed to be slightly closer, at 34cm, when I tested, it is actually the opposite. The minimum focus distance appears to be about 1cm or so further away than the TTArtisan lens, and that gives me a slightly lower maximum magnification ratio. The photo from the Fuji lens is very sharp even shooting at f2.8 as well. I was a bit surprised when I first heard TTArtisan is going to announce this lens, another autofocus lens, but this time it is for the Fujifilm X mount. And after doing all the studio testing and also shot quite a bit of real-world photos, I think this is a reasonably good lens and delivers good overall performance. Optically, the biggest weakness is still lens flare control, which is usually TTArtisan's biggest weakness, and I hope they can make some improvement to this area in the future. Comparing this lens to TTArtisan's first autofocus lens, I already can see some good improvement. Autofocus is quiet and fast. Also, I didn't notice any difference in terms of accuracy or reliability when I shoot side by side with the Fuji 27mm lens. While I think it's fair to say the Fuji is still a better lens overall, it's slightly sharper, has much better lens flare control, less vignetting, has better seal, but the TTArtisan lens has more quiet autofocus, better Sunstars, and most other areas are very similar. So consider the big price difference between these two lenses. The TTArtisan 27mm lens definitely offers excellent value for money. One thing I want to talk a little bit more is about the exterior design of the lens. There's nothing wrong with the design of this TTArtisan lens. I don't have any usability issues, and the lens looks virtually the same as the Fuji 27mm f2.8, which is a beautiful lens. But this is also the problem that I want to highlight. The TTArtisan is not a direct copy of the Fuji lens. It has a completely different optics design. It has better autofocus system, but because it looks almost the same as the Fuji lens, I think a lot of people would view it as just a cheaper copy of the Fuji lens, while it actually isn't. If you have watched my previous TTArtisan review, one thing that I've mentioned a few times is that TTArtisan is still exploring different aesthetic design of their lenses. Pretty much every single lens from TTArtisan have a very different design, and I really want to see a unified design, so when I see a TTArtisan lens, I know it is a TTArtisan lens immediately. Now, of course, some of you may not even care about this at all, but to me, I see TTArtisan has created some very nice and excellent value for money lens like this 27mm f2.8 lens, and I do really like to see them keep improving and mature, and I think the exterior design is probably one area that they could work on and improve next.